Hello and welcome back to another edition of Lives on Lockdown. And being the 13th of May, it's the anniversary of the death of the thought reader Washington Irving Bishop. I'm joined to talk about that by the historian Richard Jones. Join me after this break. Hello, Richard. Welcome back to the show. So, 131 years ago, wasn't it? On May the
I was born,
13th,
or you were born.
1889, Washington Irving Bishop, the
Indeed.
thought reader. Tell us what happened.
Did you get that?
I think, well, that's it. Thank you very much for joining us. Next time here in Lives on
Washington Irving Bishop. What a horrible way to die. Washington Irving Bishop was a very famous Victorian thought reader, or as we would call him today, a mentalist. So he was the Derren Brown of the 19th century. In fact, he did get into a bit of various other magicians. Fled from England, went to America, and became hugely successful. And he used to do sort of blindfolded acts, sort of the dagger act, where somebody would commit or somebody would be the person who committed a murder. He would go out of the room, they'd choose the person, and then he would come in and using the power of thought and a little sign, he detect who committed the murder. We find things hidden on body. Another favourite one was a favourite mentalist joke trick to this day, announcing the number on the back of a dollar bill. You could read that. So this was his act. But the problem for Washington Irving Bishop was there was a hereditary condition in his family, catalepsy. And he often went into cataleptic trances. And he was terrified that he would go into a trance and be buried alive. So consequently, he used to carry a card around with him saying that in the event of him appearing to be dead, he mustn't be buried or anything done to him until he'd started the decompose. So that's the scenario.
Until he started what? So he broke up there. Until he started what?
To decompose.
Until he started to decompose. So they had to keep his body until it started to decompose before they could do it. Is that right?
That's what he would want.
And how long does that normally take, without being gruesome about it? How long would decomposition take?
Decomposition's it starts immediately. I mean, the moment you die, decomposition begins.
But to be noticeable in those days, to be noticeable.
Yeah. And obviously medical science wouldn't know, medical doctors would notice it. So
right.
that was the scenario. 12th of May, 1889, he went to the Lamb Club in New York and he appeared on stage and he was giving his act. And the problem with this act was a lot of people wanted to know what was it that made a mind reader so special. Because don't forget, we're used to all sorts of things today, but this sort of thing was new to the Victorians. Somebody who could read your mind, someone who could read your thoughts. And so consequently, a lot of doctors were fascinated to actually know what it was that made him so good at reading people's thoughts. So he went on stage at the Lamb Club and he started doing his act. And lo and behold, he went into a cataleptic trance. So he was carried upstairs and laid down on his bed. Obviously, just by way of explanation, incidentally, catalepsy is a dreamlike trance. And it approaches, there's two forms of it. There's cataleptic trance where you appear to be asleep, and there's a narcoleptic where you appear to be dead. So narcolepsy is where they think you're dead. So in this case, he'd gone into the cataleptic trance, was taken upstairs to a room to lie down and sleep it off, woke up in the early hours of the morning, came downstairs, and just said, I'm going to carry on with the act. And they said, no, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should rest because the strain. But no, he insisted the show must go on. It's showbiz after all. So the show went on. He got back on stage. Lo and behold, he went into another trance. And he was taken upstairs, lay in bed, lingered till later that morning. And then the doctor, who was fascinated to know what it was that made a mind reader's brain tick, was so eager to get. So he called in several other doctors. And he was pronounced dead. So straight away, they removed his brain and to actually examine his brain. His mother came to New York to identify the body. There's several stories about what happened next. The more gruesome story is that he used to have his hair brushed back. So he would have his hair sort of brushed back.
Yes.
She thought, why is his hair forward like that? So she went to put his hair, the story is she went to put his hair back, as was the normal, and the top of his head came off.
Oh no, how awful.
Another story is that they just told her he was dead, and she said, "Are you certain he's dead?" But either way, he was now dead, and this became a big legal case, a big legal scandal. Had the doctors, because they were so eager, had they actually removed the brain of a man who was still alive? And the problem here was, as many newspapers started making the point, well, if he was actually in a cataleptic trance and wasn't dead, then he could well have been completely aware of what was happening. So there's all these lurid press things about how he was watching them as the scalpel came towards his head to begin to remove his head and then remove. So in fact, he was alive till the moment his brain was taken out and was completely aware of what was happening to him. It ended up the doctors were actually prosecuted, or the coroner said they should. The grand jury actually didn't agree, but then his mother took legal action and tried to get it, and eventually the doctors were found guilty. I think it was of negligence, but they weren't found guilty of actually performing. But the big question was, had the doctors, in their eagerness to examine a mind reader's brain, had they actually Bishop,
Well,
and had he been conscious?
a horrible case, and a lesson to all mind readers everywhere is
A lesson.
people are obsessed with this sort of stuff. And you and I know we're both members of the Magic Circle, and we both perform mentalist routines, and it's up to the public to decide, and different people couch it in different ways, but there's a fascination. The strange thing about this case, and you mentioned at the beginning that he used to carry a little note around with him saying, you have to wait until I'm decomposing before you can pronounce me dead. Did he not have that note with him at the Lambs Club? It was the Lambs Club in New York, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't found. The note wasn't
Okay.
found. His mother said it would have been with him. And then during the doctor's trial, his mother came forward and spoke of all the occasions when it had happened to her, because it had come through the maternal side of his family. So she suffered with cataleptic trances as well. And, and of course, you've got this situation. Dramatic as well. So the press actually took to her because she was the sort of dramatic female figure that the press today loves, but the Victorian press loved as well. So she was actually very convincing in the witness box, and she explained how all these things happened to her. They got several friends to come in and testify that they'd been present with him when he was a child and he'd gone into these trances. She said the note must have been there. Lots of people testified, but the doctor said, well, we didn't find it. The doctors appear to have been a little bit too eager to actually remove the brain. And that was one of the things, was did they act in haste and then realize the mistake they'd made?
Yeah, and it is interesting, and that's why looking at the evidence, when we look at these things, for a criminal trial, you'd have to establish two things. One is what's called an actus reus, actually the deed happened, and the other is what's called mens rea, which is a guilty mind. So that would make it criminal, and again, it would depend on the evidence. If really the doctors wanted to cause him harm, and there was that sort of intention, then obviously that would be a sort of criminal case. The negligence side, obviously, you don't necessarily have the mens rea, but did they act in a sort of proper way, bearing in mind this information? But what's really curious, as you said at the very beginning, is he would carry this note around. And I would have assumed that if this was so likely to happen, he would warn people beforehand that this may happen, and in the event that it does, wait until I decompose.
Oh yeah, or wait until you're certain I'm dead. The doctor, it was several doctors came in to pronounce him dead, but they seem to have been pushed by the main doctor to have gone to have gone, who the one who's very eager to get at Washington Irving's brain. But of course, it's this whole point of what we don't understand, and people just fascinated to find out, how can he read people's minds? Now, of course, as you and I know, a mentalist act is a mentalist act. It's great. But is the question then, and of course, you have to remember, this is, in fact, Washington Irving Bishop had started his career as a medium, working with psychic mediums, as a lot of Victorian magicians and mentalists did as well. So he was well aware of all these. But of course, this is the point where people are discovering all the things, the wonders of photography, and everything is new. Technology is making these massive leap forwards. People can now travel distances in a day that in the past would have taken them sort of weeks to travel. And then, of course, you've got this, people are starting to understand the mind. They're starting, Darwin's come along, and we're talking just a few years after Darwin, who's come along and questioned basic tenets that people have stood by for generations. And then suddenly people think, well, maybe there is more. And then, of course, you had the great spiritualist medium thing that came in the 1880s and then continued right the way through to the 1920s. And the likes of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got involved in that. So people were fascinated by this. And of course, the opportunity to examine the mind of somebody who could apparently read other people's minds. What was it that would make it different? And I think there was a bit of eagerness on the doctor's parts.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, with the person not here to defend themselves, I would certainly like to hear the evidence. I mean, you might say there's a motive there, a motive to act in haste, but certainly people are now donating their bodies to science. A lot of people are donating their brains to see if they're differently wired, and I get all of that. So certainly from that sort of stage, I can see that. The strange thing about it is, what about that note? It was so clear, as you said at the very beginning. To me, that's the thing what I'd like to look at further. Because you would have, when you get your booking, one of the things you would have done, similar to when you had a rider, you would say, okay, apart from my blue Smarties and whatever else you're going to have in your dressing room, please be aware that if I go into this state, check that I'm dead before you chop me up.
Just make sure. And of course, it's not just that. It's the horror. I mean, if eventually the coroner found that he was dead. He was already that was the
coroner did. So the coroner said, whatever happens, he was dead. Well, he certainly was by the time he took everything out.
His mother then argued that no, that there's been a cover-up, that it wasn't. It all became this. It was a major case. I mean, the international media took an interest in it.
Of course, it's got all of the elements there, because what it does, it plays to people's fear. They always say it's the sensational. We discussed this beforehand. It's the sensational that gets the headlines, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what also, it was P.T. Barnum who said, if you want to draw a crowd, start a fight, and there are no better fights than legal fights. So what happens, having a glorious, strong character like the mother, saying that my son was still alive, you should have known, this is what happened, it's murder, and there's a reason that you wanted to do, you were too keen. I think that's all of those elements, I can see why it got massive exposure. But it also plays to our fear. And it's a fear we have nowadays, which is unfounded in the majority of cases, which is why you've got to be careful when we talk about organ donations. Because people always say that it's really vital and it's essential. You see these people who are waiting for kidneys or hearts or all the different things, faces, even the things that can be transplanted now. They're so scared. One of the reasons they say they don't do it is in case they're still alive when they take it. Now, medical science has gone so far that there is minuscule possibility, and we'll get a doctor on to talk about that. There's minuscule possibility that could happen. In Victorian times, that fear would have been horrendous. It's the worst thing you could possibly think of. And he himself was so scared, is that what you started with? He was so scared that he would be buried alive, which is a mentalist trick anyway. But to be buried alive would again play to those horrendous fears. So the thing that's lacking in that story, and as a barrister, that's what I would try and dig into further, is that firstly, when you arrive with your rider, don't you make it clear to everybody, even with my little note in my pocket or not, this is what you've got to do. If I go into the state, anybody around me, you've got to tell somebody. And he would have had a number of people around him. The second thing is that it happened, you say, not just once. He fell ill. So he would have then maybe warned people, look, don't forget.
Oh,
everything happens to me, that makes sense.
Yeah, he was terrified of it, and don't forget this was a real Victorian fear. People being it's a fear throughout history. I mean, we say it doesn't happen today. I mean, it has happened into modern times. There's been examples recently of people being wheeled into, well, not recently, but in the last 10 years, of people. From what my reading, it tends to happen a lot with drug overdoses. Well, not a lot, but it can happen with drug overdoses. That people sort of get pronounced dead, and I've read about cases where people have been wheeled to the mortuary, and it's only the fact that maybe there's been a slight movement, and the mortician or the mortuary attendants thought, hang on, did that was that just a slight breath?
Yeah.
And then they go to get a second opinion, and of course, The reason we're different is because we tend now to use brain death as our true measure of death, whereas in the Victorian times it was, you know, the mirror over the mouth or to the heart. So that's why the mistake was so common in those days. And there are, I mean, if you look at the Victorian cemeteries, they used to have little bells on top of the graves that if you woke up in the coffin and you weren't dead, there'd be a little thing you could pull and the bell would ring.
So you could have that. That's right.
Yeah.
That little string which came down into the coffin, and you're there laid out, and you'd pull it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and you wake up. You wake up and think, "Oh, the room's got small. Oh, goodness me!"
But to be able to find it in the dark would be horrendous. And if it were the dark and nobody was outside and you keep ringing it, it'd be a bit of a nightmare. I mean,
horrible.
Were there cases, Richard, of anybody actually being dug out as a result of ringing that bell?
I mean, there were cases. I mean, there's cases of quite a few people who are saved at the last moment. One of the popes, apparently, he was actually on. He was about to be buried when suddenly people heard a knocking coming from inside the coffin. There's a famous story about a foreign missionary who was who died, and they held his funeral service, and the funeral service ended with his favourite hymn, and as the hymn started, the mourners were suddenly astonished by a voice joining in from the coffin. And so they opened the coffin, and there he was. So yes, I mean, the people have that. I mean, the problem we have, of course, is they say doctors can bury their mistakes. So in this case, you quite literally could, because we don't really know how many people might have been buried alive because they would have come around the coffin. My understanding is that's one of the reasons why, if the Catholic Church canonizes somebody, makes them a saint, one of the first things they do is exhume the body, or try and exhume the body, because they want to know what was their last thought. And of course, if you'd been buried alive and you came around in the coffin, that's not be an exactly godly thought. So my understanding is that's one of the reasons bodies are exhumed, to see what was the last thought that they had, and was there any sign that they've been buried alive.
Extraordinary, and all the scratching and the pulling of the bells and so on and so forth. I mean, what a horrendous tale! A horrendous tale from a legal perspective. I know we're looking at a number of cases and just digging a bit deeper into the evidence, and lots of people have written to us and said, "Look, we'd love you to examine some of these cases and dig into the evidence." All we can do, because obviously the witnesses are no longer around, what we can do is just try and work out logically what would have happened, what the arguments might have been in that sort of stage. And as I say, with this particular case, I would have thought, I go back to the point I made beforehand, as it was so important to him, having a little note and hoping that people might discover a little note would not have been the only thing he would have done. I think it would have been absolutely clear he was paranoid about being buried alive, as you said. It would have been absolutely clear he would have made it abundantly apparent to everybody involved in that production on that fateful night, that if this happened, they basically shouldn't allow him to be buried, or let alone have a lobotomy, until doctors were absolutely certain, to the extent that he started to decompose, absolutely certain that he was dead. So from that situation, I think there is sufficient evidence to at least raise very, very serious questions as to the intention behind it. And I think somebody somewhere has made a mistake.
Well, don't forget it happened once before. You could perhaps forgive it if he'd come from Philadelphia to New York, stayed, and maybe not mentioned it. But the fact it happened twice in the same night. I mean, he's often referred to as the man who died twice.
Right.
because they carried him upstairs in the trance the first time. So it had actually happened the first time, and people in the club had warned him not to go on, that the strain might bring on another one. So it wasn't as though even if the doctors didn't know about the note, it wasn't as if it hadn't happened already.
Well, I tell you, and you think about these things logically. As I say, when witnesses are no longer here, you never get the full story. What you have to do is work out what is logical. This is why when we're talking in criminal cases about reasonable doubt, because the barrister then would sort of turn around and say, well, reasonable doubt, you as a logical person who's paranoid about being buried alive, what do you think would have happened if you didn't do it the first time and you're about to go on
Yeah.
stage again? You might say, oh, hang about, Richard. If this happens again, let me just tell you that this is what I want you to do. Wait till I start decomposing before you bury me. So that's what you do, isn't it? That's what a
As
logical
Beethoven used
person would
to
do. So members of the jury, I would say to you that beyond reasonable doubt, this is what the case should be. And that's what I would think. So digging a bit deeper. But it's not, I mean, mentalists, and I think it is interesting because did they discover when they did the autopsy, did they discover anything different? Because we have our own views as to how people might do things, and people do have extra powers, and different brains are wired differently, which is why you still to this day give your body to science. I know Teresa Jowl, who I went to Canada with when we were doing the Olympics. She was our Olympic minister over here. She donated her body to science, and not just the brain sort of side, but also
Yeah.
to see about her body because she was tragically taken with cancer. But a lot of people now, doctors are learning all of the time from people donating their body to science. So people are different. And I do think sometimes creatively, the brain is wired in certain different ways. And evidence has already shown when people put these wires on your head and everything else, different parts of the brains respond at different times. So I think it's entirely reasonable that he could have had a differently created brain, and entirely reasonable that the scientists and the doctors and so on and so forth would like to examine it.
Very much so, yeah. What's interesting about, I mean, going back to the legal case, because of course, remember there were two legal cases. There was the case where the doctors were prosecuted by I think it was the state prosecuted in the first instance. When that didn't succeed, then his mother brought a civil case against the doctors. Now, interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if it's a civil case, does it become about balance of probabilities?
Exactly. So there's the difference. The criminal case, very straightforward. There's two elements generally. I know obviously general terms, we look at specifics. Two elements is a guilty mind, yes, the mens rea, as well as the actus reus, which is the guilty act. And basically, you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the person did it. And the burden of proof is on the prosecution. So it's not the defendant. The reason people say, well, why don't they go and defend themselves? They don't have to. They don't have to defend themselves. The prosecution have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the person's guilty. For commercial cases or civil cases, it is, as you rightly say, so what's called a balance of probability. Is this more likely to happen or less likely to have happened? And again, you'd look at how good the witnesses are, and I would absolutely love to cross-examine them in that sort of situation. I do not for 1 minute believe that he wouldn't have made a really big issue out of it, and for his own security, bearing in mind what you said about the fact he was paranoid about being buried alive. And I think he would make sure that it's not just a little note tucked away, but he told this person and that person and that person. And I'd want to look at that sort of evidence when productions are put on. Who are they talking to? They're talking to the lighting person, they're talking to the stage person, they're talking to the general person, the ticket office, they're talking to everybody. And I imagine the character you've just described would have told somebody else in that theatre, if this happens, make sure this is known.
Yeah. But don't forget, this is a performance not of the theatre. This is a performance of a private club. So it's like a sort of almost like a sitting room, perhaps like one of the gentlemen's clubs over in Pall Mall that you're a member of several of. And but to me, it's that point that it had happened. Well, it happened before, but it happened before on that very day or early that very morning. So it wasn't. Whether the doctors who were brought in, there was one main doctor, Dr. Irwin, and then the other ones who were brought in just to confirm it. They were all of them, all three of them were prosecuted, but then they just went forward with the main doctor, Dr. Irwin's prosecution from the mother's case, and it became the course. But the big thing with the newspapers was it played into the wonderful. Because don't forget, this is only a year after the Jack the Ripper murders. So the Jack the Ripper murders, of course, such a sensation in London. And in fact, one of Washington Irving's mind-reading routines was to find a murderer. And there was a lot of question. There were two main mind readers at the time. One was Washington Irving Bishop, and the other was a gentleman called Stuart Cumberland. And Stuart Cumberland was fantastic at, I mean, his main act was trying to find Jack the Ripper. He'd go on stage and say, I'm going to find Jack the Ripper. So much so that he, as a lot, it's a pattern followed later by Harry Houdini. It's followed by mentalists today. That he went to the media and spoke about Stuart Cumberland's dream. I dreamt I saw Jack the Ripper, and I've gone through society. And of course, it probably hadn't. But what it did do was get him publicity for his act. And so everybody wants now and going to see, oh, the man who knows who Jack the Ripper is. So
Oh, of course,
it's
absolutely. That's your headline thing, and newspapers. And we've talked about this before. Newspapers are always desperate for that headline, and murder and that sort of stuff, and intrigue, and doctors deliberately plotting to get somebody's brain. That is the stuff of media gold, isn't it? I can see how the journalists pick that up.
Yeah, and then when you read the accounts that appeared in the press, I mean, several newspapers in England. I mean, it was a lot of the reports were in the American press, but it went big in England as well because we had the telegraphs, so that it was coming over on the wire here the very same day it happened. And then you start getting all the weekend newspapers like the Graphic, and they start picking up on the story. And then they go into such lurid detail about what his final moments must have been like. Imagine lying there and you can watch, you can't do anything except watch the scalpel as it comes to your head and know that they're about.
It is the stuff of horror movies. It's if you asked anybody what they thought about it, it's being in that situation where you cannot move, but people are doing things to you is horrendous.
And to be aware that it's about to happen, and there's nothing you can do because you're conscious. You know, you are conscious. You're aware of what's going on around you. You can't do anything about it.
Horrendous tale. It is the anniversary, 131 years today, the 13th of May 2020, and it's 13th of May, 131, 131 years. Unlucky for him, but mentalists, be very careful what you say, what you think, because people will be looking at you and wondering. And
looking into you.
Speaking of which, we haven't touched on this beforehand, but it's probably an opportune moment, Richard, because you've got a gloriously rich history of your own. You have advised some of the great entertainers, let me put it that way, in history, in show business, in TV, about historical things. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I have. I've advised the likes of Michaela Strachan. I used to work with Derek Acora on Most Haunted Live, and my job was always to check the history behind anything that came out on the program. Wonderful experience. I mean, and to actually be there and watch the sort of the energy of the performance to me. And I know there's a lot of people have different opinions of psychic abilities or whatever, but there's no denying it. It's a fascinating subject. Audiences flock to see psychic demonstrations. Magicians, I know, are very critical of psychic demonstrations, and yet how many magicians will make a living from doing their own pseudo psychic
what
demonstrations?
You claim happens, and there is a difference. And we'll come back to Michaela, Michaela's lovely, but Darren's a very interesting case. The reason magicians do that, they say they can replicate it. It's like the James Randi, the great Randy, offered a massive reward saying that he can duplicate whatever these sort of fake mediums or people who claim to have these powers, whatever they do, he can show you, but only profess to do it by magic. I think that's the interesting thing. Before we get onto that, tell me about Michaela. What was the Michaela thing you did?
Oh, Michaela, we did a thing called Great British Ghosts, and we went to London. We went all over London. We went to the most haunted pub in London. We went to
which is the most haunted pub in London? Which one is it?
The Grenadier over in Wilton Mews. So, it had the reputation. It's a wonderful little pub. If you've never been to the Grenadier in Wilton Mews, it really is. It's tucked away. It's as though you've strayed into a Cornish village when you go down that mews. And then there's this tiny. There was a two-roomed pub. It's tiny, fantastic place for a Sunday.
And say the most haunted. If it's only got 2 rooms, how many ghosts are there?
Oh, they're all down in the cellar.
It was. And why? Why is it the most haunted?
Well, because in the 1960s it got into the newspapers an awful lot for ghostly goings on. So there's all sorts of reports of Scotland Yard detectives being in there. One of these, which had also put his fingers on an invisible cigarette. There's a ghostly smoke. There's a story that it was
It's
once the
interesting, Richard,
Barrett.
as soon as you started talking about ghosts, your voice became all warped.
It did. Well, that's just me. And,
I know that, yes. Yeah, but it is. That's exactly what happened.
It is spooky. It is spooky. But so that's it's playing down its haunted heritage now. I mean, it used to have lots of newspaper cuttings on the wall of ghosts when it had been reported in the newspapers. But no, we went there. We went over to the oldest parish church in London, St. Bartholomew the Great. We filmed around the churchyard there. We went in search of the wonderful, the wonderfully named ghost of Scratching Fanny of Cock Lane.
Oh no!
We went out to look for that, which was a wonderful case of, again, it was a case of spirit rapping that was heard around a house and was exposed as a fraud by Dr. Samuel Johnson, of all people. But it became a very, very famous case. It's probably London's most famous ghost story historically. And then we went over to
and there were lots of people very famously, I mean, talking about, and this is a common theme which we're exploring here, is that lots of people very famously expose people who are fraudulent mediums. And I mean, Harry Houdini is a case in point. And talk a little bit about him.
Well, Houdini wanted to believe. I mean, that was the point about Harry Houdini. He wanted to believe. He was desperate to get in touch with his mother had died. He was very close to his mother, and and so he wanted the proof that his mother was. So he was forever going round, and it was the problem with not the problem, but the thing about Houdini was he'd actually his act had been playing the part of a medium. Initially, that was one of his early acts. So he knew all the thing. The wonderful thing about Houdini is that he was massive. I mean, we probably today we don't realise just how massive this man was globally. He was a superstar.
Massive, but not in stature. He was quite tiny in stature.
In stature, he was very tiny, and it's. But he basically went all over the world. The interesting thing was with Houdini, and
Richard, again, your voice is sounding mangled. Clearly, things are coming through tonight, which don't normally come.
Houdini's coming through to me.
He's clearly trying to speak from the grave.
Houdini's there. No, Houdini became very good friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah.
Of course, now Conan Doyle believed implicitly in mediumship. Houdini obviously did, and they had great debates about it. Conan Doyle was convinced that Houdini, and tried to convince Houdini that he had psychic powers, but didn't realize he had psychic powers. Right. Houdini kept saying, "No, I know how it's done," and of course he became famous for going to seances in disguise, and so I mean that was one of his things for an exposure. But it became a big magician's thing of the 19th century. A lot of 19th century magicians would go to seances and try and expose the mediums. It's amazing how many scientific men were believers in just as well. If you take W.T. Stead, who was a name that's probably largely forgotten today, but Stead was the editor of a newspaper called the Pall Mall Gazette, and it was a fantastic edit. He's probably the man who invented or the Pall Mall Gazette invented investigative journalism, where journalists would go undercover. It was a man named James Greenwood who went undercover. It's the first time this had been done, but he actually dressed up as a vagrant and went and spent a night in the workhouse. It's a very famous series in the workhouse, probably the very first one. What he did was that prior to that, the people likes of Charles Dickens had exposed the poverty, had written about it, but they hadn't experienced it firsthand. They'd written about it. Greenwood's idea was, I'll go in and I'll be the poor and see what happens. And these were horrendous articles. I mean, if you ever get the chance to read them, the night in the workhouse. And that led to a terrific onslaught from about the 1870s onwards of journalists wanting to do likewise. So you had all sorts of journalists taking on the clothing of vagrants and going into the East End, the East End of London, but places, but mostly the East End of London, because that was the poverty-stricken part, and that's where the poverty was. And one of the things you can't help thinking is that one of the reasons that the poor couldn't get into the workhouses in the 19th century was because so many investigative journalists had got in there first to find out what it was like in the workhouses. So this started off investigative journalism, and then Stead then became the one. He was very famous for the Babylon articles, the modern Babylon, where the purpose of them was to expose child prostitution in London, and he went so far as to purchase a girl from her mother, and then the idea was get them to in London. He actually went to prison for that, for taking a minor out of the country without the mother's permission, but it was a massive impact in 1885 when the articles came out, and the and it was they passed I've forgotten the name of the Act of Parliament now, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, and that did two things. One was raise the age of consent to 16, and the other one was it made homosexuality a criminal offence, and the actual itself a criminal offence, and of course that was enforced till 1967 horribly. But that all came out of Stead's journalism. And then he became a spiritualist. He became one of the leading advocates of spiritualists and used to write his sort of spiritualist letters. And he became a great, and ultimately went to New York to lecture on spiritualism. And, you'll never guess what he went to New York on.
Go on then.
Have a guess.
He wasn't on the Titanic, was he?
He was indeed. He went down on the Titanic.
That's quite right. I'll tell you an interesting thing from a history point of view is that my grandfather had a business in Lavenham, which is a beautiful, beautiful place over in Suffolk. And I took my mother back there fairly recently. We'd spoken about it. It hadn't been for years and years and years. I took her back fairly recently. And we went to a museum there. And we discovered that my grandfather actually owned most of Lavenham in that stage. He was quite a very important, wonderful man, and very humble, but a very successful businessman. And he had a factory there, which I discovered from the museum. They actually supplied the silk blinds to the Titanic.
Wow. Isn't that incredible?
It is. I hope they got paid up front, but it's a terrible thing to say. But yeah. But the reality is, and this is a really, really important topic, is that, and we always say this, is that we're both members of the Magic Circle. We can reproduce, a number of members of the Magic Circle can reproduce what a lot of mediums claim is as a result of extra powers that they have. Yeah?
Very much so, yeah.
And so the challenge is, and I would love, in this whole series, we're not judgmental or anything. What we want to do is to keep an open mind. I do believe a common tenet should be, we want to question everything, because we don't know everything. We are open to be persuaded about other things and everything else. So the challenge, I would say, to anybody watching this today, if you have special powers, I would love you to come onto the show, and I'll put you together with a member of the Magic Circle, a magician, and let's have a look. Let's talk about it. Let's debate it. Let's try some experiments in the same way as James Randi did. And he offered, it was a huge reward, wasn't it? Was it £1 million? Like $1 million in the States for somebody who could prove it in scientific conditions. And I would really like that. So if you have special powers and would like to come on the show, write to LOL, that's LOL at octopustv.com, and we will get you on the show, and we'd like to talk to you about that. I look forward to hearing from everybody on that. Richard,
can I just ask there before we go? When you said we'll give about $1 million, were you saying you would?
Well, no, but if you have a look at that bookshelf behind you, I think you'll find there's some of it stashed away.
It's on the top shelf over there.
It's on the top shelf.
Can I try then? Can I? Because I think I've got the power.
I knew you were going to say that. It's got to be.
I would like you to think. I'd like you to think of a number.
Well then.
Between 1 and 5.
Yeah.
Okay. Not an even number. Not 1, not 5. And just think. It's coming to me, Andrew. It's coming to me.
Richard Jones, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Join us
Thank you.
next time for more Lives on Lockdown. But for now, ghost and otherwise, have a good night and stay safe.
Woo.
Be alert, and we'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
You look very demonic there.
Always demonic, always good.